It was dawn on a cold grey morning in November 1944. The fields outside Aachen, Germany, were soaked with mist and the smell of burnt oil. A line of US Sherman tanks from the 3rd Armored Division stood motionless behind a hedgerow, engines idling, their crews tense and exhausted after days of close-quarter fighting. The fog rolled low over the ground, muffling the distant artillery. Somewhere ahead, a German tank platoon was regrouping beyond a ruined village, invisible but close enough that every man in the Shermans could feel the pressure of its presence. Inside one of those tanks, the gunner, a 23-year-old corporal from Ohio, wiped grime from the periscope lens. He had barely slept in 2 days. His commander's voice came through the intercom, calm but strained. "Hold position until orders." The words carried authority but not conviction. They all knew the Germans were moving. The gunner's hand rested on the elevation wheel, his boot near the foot trigger. Through the narrow scope, shapes flickered in the haze, black outlines that looked like moving turrets. The men could hear the faint metallic squeal of panzer treads. The enemy was advancing again. One more counterattack before the Americans could push through to the Roer River. The gunner's pulse thudded against his temples. He had been trained to follow orders, to fire only on command, to trust the chain of command. But something felt wrong, too quiet, too close. His instinct told him the Germans had spotted their position. Seconds stretched into silence. The radio crackled with distant chatter, other platoons requesting artillery support, a lieutenant trying to re-establish contact. No new orders came. The fog began to lift, revealing the charred outlines of burned trees and the jagged skeletons of farmhouses. Then, in a brief clearing, he saw them. 3 German Panthers moving in line formation, turrets facing forward. The lead tank adjusted its barrel, turning directly toward the American position. The commander was still waiting for confirmation from Battalion HQ. The gunner felt his body tense. His mind screamed to act before it was too late. Discipline clashed with instinct, training with survival. Then he made the decision that would define his life and the fate of everyone around him. He gripped the trigger, took aim at the lead Panther and fired. The shell left the barrel with a deafening crack that shook the turret. A flash of orange tore through the fog, followed by the thunderous roar of detonation. The gunner's round struck the Panther square in its frontal glacis, one of the few weak points visible through the haze. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the German tank erupted in a column of fire and black smoke, the blast rippling across the wet ground. Inside the Sherman, every man froze. They had just broken one of the most sacred battlefield rules: no fire without authorization. But there was no time to reflect. The explosion triggered chaos among the remaining German tanks. Radio chatter burst alive across the American platoon. "Enemy armor hit! Contact front!" The commander slammed the intercom switch, shouting coordinates to the others. Their position was now compromised, but the gunner's defiant shot had forced the Germans to halt their advance. Through the periscope, he could see the 2nd Panther trying to maneuver, its tracks half submerged in mud, struggling to turn its massive 75mm gun toward them. This was the brutal reality of the Western Front in late 1944. The Germans still possessed superior armor and firepower. A single Tiger or Panther could outgun an entire column of Shermans. The Americans, however, had numbers, logistics, and relentless momentum. Their tanks were lighter, faster, and more expendable. The doctrine favored coordination, multiple Shermans overwhelming a single target, each playing its part in a deadly chess game of movement and fire. But that doctrine depended on timing, and timing in battle often dissolved into confusion. Orders were supposed to flow from the company level down to the platoons, then to each crew. But in combat, radio static, jammed frequencies, and shattered lines of communication turned precision into guesswork. Commanders demanded discipline. Gunners relied on instinct. The difference between heroism and insubordination was often a single moment's hesitation or courage. The young corporal's defiance could have cost him a court-martial. Yet that unauthorized shot had just destroyed the lead Panther, and with it, the enemy's confidence. Smoke drifted across the field, curling around broken trees and shattered fences. The commander leaned forward, eyes wide. "You hit it," he whispered. "You actually hit it." Outside, the 2nd Panther's turret turned toward them, its barrel lowering, ready to fire. The American gunner reloaded without waiting for orders. This battle wasn't over yet, it was only beginning. Corporal James D. Miller had grown up in a steel town along the Ohio River. Before the war, he worked nights at a foundry, forging the same kind of metal that now shaped his destiny inside the turret of a Sherman tank. When he enlisted in 1942, he wasn't looking for glory, only escape from the smoke-choked mills and the feeling that the world was moving without him. By 1944, he was part of the 3rd Armored Division, the spearhead that had carved through France and now stood at Germany's threshold. He was known among his crew as quiet, methodical, the one who didn't miss. His hands bore small burn scars from endless drills with the M3 75mm cannon, the heart of their Sherman. Each man in the 5-man crew trusted the others completely. There was Captain Reynolds, the veteran commander with 2 campaigns behind him, Sergeant Lopez, the driver whose humor cut through the tension, Private Red Turner, the loader, 19 years old and already hardened, and Corporal Hughes, the assistant driver and radio operator. Together they lived, fought, and nearly died in a steel shell barely 7 feet tall. Their lives inside the tank were a ritual of noise, heat, and confinement. The reek of gunpowder mixed with engine fumes. The walls dripped with condensation. They spoke in short bursts, coordinates, bearings, confirmation. Miller rarely looked up from the sight. Through that narrow circle of glass, he had seen everything. Hedgerows erupting under artillery fire, German soldiers fleeing through smoke, and once, a burning tank that looked eerily human as flames licked through its turret. Training had drilled one lesson into every American gunner: wait for the order. Commanders coordinated, gunners executed. The hierarchy kept chaos at bay, but war eroded boundaries. By late 1944, experience had replaced manuals. Soldiers who survived learned to read the battlefield faster than the officers could relay it. Miller had watched too many friends die waiting for permission to fire. Somewhere along the way, hesitation had become more dangerous than disobedience. That morning outside Aachen, when the fog thinned and he saw the German armor moving into position, all his instincts screamed that the enemy had already spotted them. His commander's order to hold position wasn't wrong. It was regulation. But it was suicide if the Panthers fired first. Miller's pulse steadied. The crosshairs aligned. Every lesson, every hour of training, every fragment of fear dissolved into that single motion of pulling the trigger. The explosion confirmed what he already knew. In that moment, disobedience had saved them all. But the battle had only paused. The Germans were reorganizing. And now, with the enemy enraged and aware, the real test of survival was about to begin. Moments after Miller's shot tore through the lead Panther, the tank radio crackled to life with a sudden burst of overlapping voices. Command frequencies were crowded with static, panic, and the clipped urgency of men trying to make sense of chaos. All units hold fire until confirmation. Repeat, hold position. The order came too late. The battle had already begun. Captain Reynolds slammed his fist against the turret rim. He was furious, not because Miller had fired, but because the shot had forced them all into motion before the chain of command was ready. "We're blown," he shouted through the intercom. Lopez pivot left. "Red, reload, armor piercing, quick." The crew responded instantly, their training overriding fear. Shell casings clattered on the floor as Red slammed another round into the breach. Miller adjusted the elevation wheel, eyes locked on the shifting fog. Outside, the surviving Panthers spread out, trying to flank the Shermans. Their engines roared with deep mechanical fury, echoing off the ruined village walls. German tank doctrine emphasized aggressive counterattack, never remain stationary after contact. The Americans knew this. A single moment's hesitation could mean destruction. Yet the radio kept insisting, no advance until confirmation from battalion. The words sounded detached, far away, written for a battlefield that no longer existed. At the command post a few hundred yards behind them, Lieutenant Colonel Henry Bowers stared at a map pinned across the hood of a jeep. Reports were inconsistent. 2 enemy tanks destroyed, 1 platoon advancing, 1 retreating. He knew better than to rely on clarity. War on the Western Front was improvisation disguised as planning. Every engagement was a tangle of incomplete information. His priority was maintaining formation integrity. No lone actions, no exposure. But in the fog-covered field ahead, Miller and his crew weren't thinking about maps. They were staring at muzzle flashes. The second Panther fired first, a high-velocity shell slicing through the mist and striking just short of their position, throwing dirt and shrapnel across the Sherman's hull. The concussion slammed through the crew compartment, ringing their ears. "Driver forward 10 meters," Reynolds ordered. The tank lurched ahead, treads grinding over torn earth. They had officially violated the last standing order, no movement until authorization. Yet it was movement that saved them. The next German shell whistled overhead and detonated behind them, where they had been seconds earlier. Miller's sight caught the second Panther's flank as it repositioned. He aimed fast, fired again, and the round hit home. Armor shattered, turret engulfed in flame. For command, the situation was unraveling. For Miller's crew, it was survival, and survival didn't wait for permission. On the opposite ridge, Oberfeldwebel Heinrich Krüger scanned the tree line through his Zeiss binoculars. He commanded a platoon of 3 Panthers, veterans of the 9th Panzer Division, tasked with halting the American advance toward Aachen. The men under him were experienced but exhausted. Supplies were low, fuel scarce, morale brittle. Every engagement now felt like delay rather than victory. Still, the order was clear. Hold the line and buy time for reinforcements. Krüger's unit had taken position behind a narrow band of oak trees overlooking the valley. The landscape was soaked and muddy from the previous week's rain. The distant rumble of artillery never stopped. As the fog lifted in uneven swirls, he could just make out the silhouettes of the American Shermans. 3, maybe 4, he muttered. Light armor. His gunner nodded silently, hands steady on the traverse crank. To the Germans, Shermans were an enigma, dangerous in numbers, but individually fragile. Krüger had destroyed 5 during the Normandy campaign. He respected their speed, but scorned their armor. "One shot, one fireball," his crew often said. What they didn't expect that morning was initiative, an enemy who broke pattern. When the first American round tore through his lead tank, Krüger was stunned. "Verdammt! They've seen us!" he shouted. But it was too late. Flames erupted from the forward Panther, ammunition cooking off in violent bursts. His surviving tank scattered, tracks grinding deep into the wet soil as they sought cover. Through the smoke, Krüger spotted the muzzle flash of a Sherman firing again. Fast, precise, almost instinctive. "How are they firing so quickly?" his loader asked. Krüger didn't answer. He was already ordering his gunner to return fire. The shot went wide, exploding harmlessly into a hedgerow. Communication between the German tanks was breaking down. Static filled their radios, mixed with fragments of English chatter bleeding through. Krüger's second tank, commanded by a younger lieutenant, tried to flank the Americans but bogged down in a ditch. He cursed and waved his driver forward, desperate to maintain cohesion. The Americans were coordinating by instinct now, firing in bursts, shifting positions. Everything their manual had told them not to do. To Krüger, it looked reckless. To the Americans, it was survival through adaptation. He couldn't know that their lead gunner had disobeyed orders, or that one man's defiance had triggered the entire counteraction. All he saw was a sudden, unexpected ferocity, a kind of aggression that didn't fit the pattern of cautious Allied armor. Smoke thickened, the field disappearing into chaos. His men shouted over the intercoms as another explosion rocked the ridge. Krüger realized with grim clarity that this wasn't a skirmish anymore. It was a slaughter waiting to happen, and his platoon was on the wrong end of it. Inside the Sherman, Miller steadied his breath. The air was thick with the stench of burnt oil and cordite, and the faint ringing in his ears made every sound feel distant. Outside, the fog had dissolved into smoke, curling around the black silhouettes of ruined Panthers. Through his gun sight, Miller could see the second German tank still burning, its ammunition popping like distant fireworks. The third Panther was repositioning behind a rise, trying to use the terrain for cover. He knew it would only take one precise shot from that 75mm KWK gun to destroy them. "Hold fire, Miller," Captain Reynolds barked, his voice strained but commanding. "We can't see the full flank yet. Wait for range confirmation." The command echoed in Miller's headset, but his focus stayed locked through the scope. He could see the shadow of movement, the faint outline of the Panther's turret rotating toward them. He had seconds, maybe less. His left hand tightened on the traverse wheel, right hand on the trigger. The logic of training screamed obedience. The instinct of survival screamed action. The crew held their breath. Private Turner's hand hovered near the next shell, his knuckles white. Outside, the 3rd Panther's gun flashed, a blinding streak across the field. The shell screamed past, clipping the top of their Sherman's turret and detonating behind them. The entire tank rocked violently. Dirt and debris rained down from above. "That was close," Reynolds shouted. "Driver, reverse 5 meters, fast." Lopez threw the gears into reverse, treads churning mud, engine howling. Miller's sight readjusted, the crosshairs sweeping back across the enemy's position. The Panther was exposed now, its lower hull momentarily visible above the rise. No time for a second order, no time for confirmation. In that split instant, Miller's world narrowed to one motion. He fired. The recoil slammed into his shoulder as the 75mm round tore through the air and struck dead center beneath the German turret. A flash, then a dull, gut-deep explosion. The Panther's hatch burst open, flames spilling out as its crew scrambled and fell away. The tank shuddered once, then went still. The Sherman's interior erupted in shouts. Turner reloaded, adrenaline coursing through the cramped compartment. Reynolds was already radioing their position, reporting the kills. The line hissed with static, then a clipped voice answered, "Negative engagement authorization. Who fired?" Reynolds ignored it. Outside, the battlefield had gone eerily quiet except for the hiss of burning metal. 3 Panthers destroyed in under 2 minutes, an outcome so improbable it defied logic. Across the fog-laced valley, the remaining German infantry were in full retreat, dragging wounded and abandoning damaged vehicles. Miller leaned back from the sight, chest heaving. He didn't feel victorious, only stunned. His hands shook from the recoil, but his eyes were steady. He had done what instinct demanded, not what command required. And in doing so, he had just altered the course of that battle, and perhaps his own fate. The battlefield exploded into movement. The chain of command fractured as radio reports flooded across the frequencies, conflicting, urgent, half-believed. American units down the line picked up fragments of the transmission. German armor neutralized. Unknown platoon fired first. Coordinates unclear. Officers demanded clarity, but in the fog of war there was no such thing. What was clear, however, was the sight rising over the ridgeline. 3 burning German Panthers. Black smoke curling upward like columns of ink against the pale November sky. Captain Reynolds' tank sat motionless, engine humming low, its turret scanning for new threats. Around them, the field was strewn with shattered timber, churned earth, and fragments of German armor glowing red-hot. The explosion of the last Panther had detonated ammunition inside the wreck, sending a shockwave that flattened a nearby hedgerow. For a moment, the world was soundless except for the hiss of steam from ruptured cooling systems and the occasional crack of burning fuel. In the command net, panic turned to disbelief. "Confirm 3 enemy tanks destroyed?" came the incredulous voice from Battalion HQ. "Affirmative," Reynolds replied evenly, though his voice trembled. "Engagement successful. German counterattack neutralized." He hesitated, glancing toward Miller, who was still gripping the gun's traverse handle. Shot was fired. Preemptively. The silence that followed was long and heavy. Everyone knew what that meant. The surrounding American tanks began to advance, cautious but emboldened. Infantry from the 26th Regiment followed, moving through the smoke with weapons raised, scanning for survivors. One of them, a young sergeant named Blake, stopped to stare at the wreckage. "Jesus," he muttered. "One tank did this?" The sight spread quickly through the line, retold over radios and shouted across foxholes. One Sherman took out 3 Panthers. It sounded like myth, the kind of story soldiers tell to steady their nerves before the next battle. But there was no myth inside Miller's tank, only silence. The gunner's hands trembled as the adrenaline faded. Red Turner looked at him, eyes wide. "You just saved us, Jimmy," he said quietly. "You know that, right?" Miller nodded once, unable to speak. The enormity of what he had done, defying orders, firing on instinct, destroying an entire platoon, was settling in like a weight. Outside, the Germans were in disarray. Their infantry, deprived of tank cover, retreated toward the village ruins, pursued by American mortar fire. Kruger's radio went dead in the chaos. His last transmission, intercepted by Allied intelligence hours later, simply read, Enemy armor stronger than expected, pulling back. For Miller, the battlefield looked surreal now. Smoke and fog blurred everything into shades of grey. His commander was already reporting to HQ, his tone clipped, cautious, careful not to say too much. The rest of the crew waited for what would come next. Commendation or punishment, no one could tell. Above them, the sound of distant aircraft engines grew louder, thunderbolts circling for targets of opportunity. The battle was over for now, but the war inside that Sherman had just begun. Miller's disobedience had saved lives and broken trust. And in the strict world of armored warfare, that would not go unnoticed. By midday, the entire front had shifted. The German counterattack that had threatened to collapse the American left flank was gone, shattered by the destruction of Kruger's platoon. What began as a local clash near a nameless ridge outside Aachen turned into a decisive repulse. Infantry from the 26th Regiment pushed forward behind the remaining Shermans, clearing trenches and pockets of resistance with a methodical rhythm. Every few minutes the ground shook as artillery from the rear fired fresh salvos to cut off retreating enemy troops. Captain Reynolds's platoon advanced cautiously through the haze, hulls blackened with soot, treads grinding over the debris of battle. In the distance, the silhouette of a Panther still burned. Its turret collapsed inward from the explosion. For the Americans, it was a rare sight, 3 destroyed Panzers in a single engagement. The morale boost rippled through the company like an electric current. Radio chatter grew confident. Commanders congratulated one another. The push toward the Roer River could resume. Inside the Sherman, the mood was harder to define. The men felt relief, pride, and unease in equal measure. "They're falling back," Lopez said from the driver's seat, staring through his periscope. "And we actually broke them." Turner grinned weakly but said nothing. Miller remained silent, still watching the drifting smoke outside the scope. He knew what came next. The military had little tolerance for improvisation, even when it worked. At the battalion command post, Lieutenant Colonel Bowers listened to conflicting reports from the field. 3 Panthers destroyed by 1 section, an aide read from the log. Unconfirmed. Initial fire unauthorized. Bowers removed his headset, pinched the bridge of his nose and said quietly, "Unauthorized or not, it bought us time." He turned to his operations officer. "Mark their position for commendation review and disciplinary inquiry." In war, paperwork and praise often traveled the same path. As the Americans consolidated their gains, German resistance melted away. Kruger's surviving infantry withdrew toward the forest line, leaving behind wrecks and abandoned equipment. For every man who reached cover, another was captured or lost to artillery fire. The sound of combat faded to scattered rifle shots and the distant rumble of retreating engines. By dusk, the valley was silent, except for the occasional hiss of steam from ruined tanks. The air was heavy with the smell of diesel and scorched metal. Miller climbed halfway out of the turret, his face streaked with soot, and looked across the field they had just fought for. Bodies lay half buried in mud. The glow of burning armor painted the horizon in dull orange. It didn't feel like victory. It felt like survival bought with luck and instinct. Reynolds leaned out beside him and said quietly, "HQ wants a full report tonight." Miller nodded without speaking. He knew that report would decide whether his name went into the commendation list or the disciplinary file. For now, the ridge was theirs. The counterattack was broken, but consequences like smoke had a way of drifting back. By the time the sun fell behind the ridge, the battlefield had turned into a graveyard of machines. The air hung thick with diesel fumes, cordite, and the faint sweetness of scorched vegetation. American medics moved quietly between the hulks of burned armor, searching for anyone still breathing. The earth was pitted with craters and scattered with shell fragments, helmets, and torn rations. Every few minutes, something deep inside one of the German tanks would detonate with a dull thump, a leftover shell cooking off in the heat. Miller's crew had dismounted from the Sherman and stood near their tank, stretching cramped limbs and staring at what they'd done. The 3 Panthers still smoked in the distance, their black silhouettes bent and skeletal against the evening haze. "Never seen anything like it," Turner muttered. 3 of them gone. Lopez gave a low whistle, shaking his head. Reynolds didn't answer. He was scribbling notes for his after-action report, the kind of bureaucratic detail that could mean the difference between praise and punishment. Down the slope, a recovery team was already moving in. Engineers photographed the destroyed Panthers, marking impact angles, penetration points, and ammunition effects. They needed data. Every tank kill was evidence for the Ordnance Department's analysis, proof that American weapons could stand against German armor. When they reached the first Panther, one of the officers whistled softly. The hole where Miller's shot had entered was perfectly placed just below the mantlet, a 1 in 1,000 strike. Luck, someone said. Another man, older, shook his head. Instinct. For the Germans, the losses were devastating. Later records from the 9th Panzer Division listed 3 tanks destroyed beyond repair, 1 platoon leader killed, and 21 infantry casualties. A small engagement by the war's standards, but one that left a gap in the local defensive line. It forced their withdrawal 3 miles east, opening the road toward Eschweiler and the Rohr. That night, as the rain began to fall again, Miller's unit bivouacked near the ruins of a farmhouse. The crews worked in silence, cleaning guns, checking tracks, refueling. When the food came, lukewarm rations and black coffee, no one spoke of the battle. The adrenaline was gone, replaced by exhaustion, and the quiet realization that they'd survived another day. Miller sat on an ammo crate under the tank's side skirt, staring at the streaks of mud on his boots. In his pocket, he carried a small photo of his family, creased and worn. He unfolded it with greasy fingers and stared at it until the rain blurred the image. For the first time since dawn, the enormity of what he had done hit him. His disobedience had saved their platoon, but it had also broken trust with every level of command. In the morning there would be questions, maybe punishment. Reynolds passed by, pausing just long enough to say, "Get some sleep, Miller." "You did what you had to." The words offered little comfort. Above them, thunder rolled over the valley, echoing faintly like distant artillery. Tomorrow the war would move on. But for Miller, the battle he had fought and the decision he had made wasn't over. It had only changed shape. The report reached battalion headquarters by dawn. Typed on smudged carbon paper, it outlined the engagement in dry, bureaucratic precision. 3 enemy tanks destroyed by Section C, 3rd Armored Division, north of Aachen. Engagement occurred under fog conditions. Initial fire executed without prior authorization. The language was neutral, almost sterile, but every officer who read it understood the weight beneath the words. Someone had broken the rules, and won. Lieutenant Colonel Henry Bowers stood over a folding field desk, reading the report twice before setting it down. Around him, the command tent buzzed with low conversation and the constant tapping of typewriters. He looked at the attached photographs, black and white prints of the wrecked Panthers, their armor peeled open by direct hits. "Unauthorized," he said quietly, "but effective." His executive officer, Major Grady, frowned. "We can't let gunners start making their own calls. Next time it might trigger a friendly fire incident." Bowers nodded. "True, but if we punish initiative, we'll paralyze them." War by late 1944 had become a constant negotiation between discipline and improvisation. Command wanted control. Survival demanded instinct. The front lines moved too fast, communications too fragile, and chaos too absolute for perfect order. Bowers had seen officers court-martialed for less, but he'd also seen careers made from the same kind of gamble. "Find out who fired that first shot," he said. "I want his file." Within hours, word spread through the division. Some called Miller reckless, others called him a hero. Among the tank crews, the story grew. 1 gunner, 3 kills, no orders. By midday, it reached Corps Command, where a colonel requested an official investigation. But investigations take time, and time in war was a luxury. The 3rd Armored was already moving east. When the courier jeep arrived with the summons, Captain Reynolds stepped out of his tank and met the officer halfway. "Captain Reynolds," the courier said, "you and your gunner are requested at Battalion HQ." Reynolds didn't argue. He knew the tone, formal, final. "Understood," he said, turning to Miller. "Pack your gear. They want to talk." The drive to headquarters was silent, except for the hum of the jeep and the occasional thud of distant artillery. Miller watched the countryside blur by. Flattened villages, twisted trees, telephone poles split by shrapnel. He wasn't afraid of punishment, not exactly. He was afraid of being misunderstood. He had acted to save lives, not to defy orders. But war didn't always reward motives. It rewarded results. At HQ, Bowers met them personally. The tent smelled of wet canvas and coffee. The colonel studied the two men for a long moment before speaking. "I read your report," he said finally. "3 Panthers destroyed. That's remarkable." His eyes fixed on Miller. "You fired first?" "Yes, sir," Miller replied quietly. Bowers nodded, expression unreadable. "You disobeyed a direct order." "Yes, sir." Another pause. Then almost reluctantly Bowers said, "And in doing so you may have saved 50 men. Maybe more." He set the paper aside. "Discipline keeps the army alive. Initiative wins wars. Sometimes they don't agree." He dismissed them without a verdict. Outside, Reynolds exhaled slowly. That could have gone worse. Miller said nothing. He didn't feel exonerated, only suspended between guilt and relief. The field had given him clarity. The headquarters only confusion. And beyond that tent the war continued, indifferent to either. On the other side of the front, the German record of that brief, violent encounter would read very differently. In the archives of the 9th Panzer Division, the entry for November 14, 1944, was short and bitter. 3 Piscopia WWII lost to sudden American tank fire during fog. Enemy displayed uncharacteristic precision and aggression. Platoon leader Oberfeldwebel Krüger missing, presumed killed. Morale shaken. The report was signed by Major Werner Kappel, a veteran officer who had watched the once proud division dissolve into fragments under constant Allied pressure. In interviews conducted after the war, survivors from Krüger's platoon described the engagement as instantaneous. One gunner recalled, "We saw no muzzle flash, only the fireball from our lead tank. The enemy was invisible until it was too late." Another wrote in a post-war letter that it was the first time we felt hunted, not hunting. For years, German crews had dominated armored warfare through superior optics, range and coordination. Now at the edge of winter, they were fighting blind, outnumbered, low on fuel, and pursued relentlessly by an enemy that never seemed to tire. The Americans had become what the Germans once were, fast, coordinated and ruthless when the opportunity appeared. The psychological shock of losing 3 Panthers to a single platoon was immense. Rumors spread through the regiment that the Americans were using a new type of armor-piercing shell, or a hidden anti-tank ambush. Intelligence officers found no evidence of either. What they did confirm was a shift in tactics. U.S. crews were acting faster, trusting experience over procedure. Captured correspondence from the German side revealed a growing sense of inevitability. One letter from a junior officer, later found near Eschweiler, read, "They react before we do. They fire without command. It is chaos, but it works." Even Wehrmacht analysts noted the change in Allied behavior. A December report from Army Group B described increasingly independent American armor units employing spontaneous attack and defense maneuvers. What that meant, in plain terms, was that the enemy had learned flexibility, and it was killing them. For the men who fought that morning, the memory remained vivid. Decades later, a surviving German loader interviewed for a documentary described watching the Sherman rounds tear through their formation. His voice, aged and trembling, carried no anger, only resignation. "They were faster," he said simply. "They didn't wait. They just acted." In the scale of the war, the engagement was a minor footnote, but within the German ranks it symbolized something larger, the shift of initiative. The confidence that had once defined the Wehrmacht was gone. The Americans were now dictating the rhythm of battle, and behind that shift was the very thing Miller had embodied. A decision made in seconds, without permission but with perfect instinct. For Corporal James Miller, the war did not end with medals or ceremonies. A week after the engagement, his unit advanced deeper into Germany, through villages reduced to rubble and forests stripped bare by artillery. His name circulated quietly within the division. Some called him the gunner from Aachen, others the man who didn't wait. But official recognition never came. The army preferred clean narratives, heroism that aligned neatly with discipline. Disobedience, even when successful, was harder to frame. The inquiry into the unauthorized engagement concluded without a formal verdict. Colonel Bowers's final report noted, "The crew demonstrated initiative under duress. Recommend no disciplinary action." It was the bureaucratic way of saying the matter was closed. Miller's commander, Captain Reynolds, received a Bronze Star for leadership under fire. Miller's name was not included. His crew didn't speak of it again. In an army fighting across half of Europe, survival itself was enough recognition, but the event stayed with him. In the nights that followed, when the guns fell silent and the crew camped under the tank's shadow, Miller replayed that moment again and again. The fog, the hesitation, the sound of his own breath before the trigger broke. It wasn't pride he felt, but an unease that never left him. He had saved lives, but he had also crossed a line that every soldier is trained to obey. War blurred those lines until right and wrong became indistinguishable from survival. When the war ended in May 1945, Miller returned to Ohio. The foundry still stood where he had left it, the same smokestacks rising over the river. He worked there for years, quiet and unassuming. His co-workers knew he had been in the war, but never pressed him for stories. Every now and then a fragment slipped out, a mention of a village near Aachen, or the way fog looked when mixed with smoke. He never spoke about the shot itself. Decades later, when his division's veterans gathered for reunions, the story resurfaced. A few remembered it clearly. 1 gunner, 1 forbidden shot, 3 destroyed Panthers. Others dismissed it as a myth, one of those exaggerated tales that grow with time. But the records were there, the photos, the reports, the coordinates. It had happened. Miller lived the rest of his life quietly, dying in 1989. Among his belongings, his daughter found a small metal box containing a faded photograph of his crew and a fragment of armor the size of a hand, blackened, twisted, marked by impact. On the back of the photo, written in faint pencil, were 5 words, "Sometimes orders come too late." That sentence, simple and unsentimental, captured the truth that commanders rarely admitted, but every soldier understood. The battlefield was not a classroom. It was a storm, and sometimes only instinct could keep a man alive inside it. In the years that followed, the U.S. Army quietly absorbed the lessons from hundreds of encounters like Miller's. On paper, it was called Initiative Under Fire, a doctrine shift that recognized the chaos of modern mechanized war. In practice, it was born from moments of fear and instinct, like that morning outside Aachen. Reports from armored divisions across Europe had shown the same pattern. The most effective crews were those who acted first, thought fast and trusted experience over rigid command. After the war, the U.S. Army's leadership studied these field reports intensely. The Armored Force Board concluded that crew-level initiative in limited visibility conditions had become a decisive factor against superior German equipment. Translation: the Americans had learned to improvise. They compensated for thinner armor and less powerful guns with coordination, speed, and the courage to act independently. Miller's story, though never formally cited, reflected exactly that evolution. German officers who were later debriefed by Allied intelligence noticed the same transformation. One remarked, "By 1944, the Americans were not the same enemy we met in 1942. They had learned unpredictability. It was both compliment and warning. The discipline that once made armies efficient had also made them predictable. The Americans, by embracing controlled disorder, had turned flexibility into strategy. That principle would shape every conflict after World War II. From Korea to Vietnam and beyond, small unit autonomy became central to American doctrine. The idea that a single soldier or gunner could alter the course of a fight wasn't romantic. It was necessary. Radios failed, visibility disappeared, and orders came late. In those moments, survival depended on initiative. Commanders began teaching what Miller had learned instinctively: act first, correct later. But the lesson came with a price. War demanded balance. Initiative could win battles, but it could also cause tragedy if misjudged. The Army spent decades refining the line between action and recklessness, between instinct and insubordination. Yet history showed that the difference was often defined only by outcome. A decision that saved lives became initiative. One that failed became disobedience. Miller's engagement outside Aachen never entered the official histories, but its shadow lingered in training manuals, war colleges, and the quiet conversations of tank officers who understood. It was a reminder that courage didn't always look like heroism. It often looked like hesitation, followed by a decision no one else dared to make. For the men who fought in tanks, sealed in steel coffins under fire, that truth was sacred. Every second mattered. Every instinct carried weight. And sometimes, as one gunner proved, the right choice came from defying the very order meant to protect them. That paradox, obedience versus survival, became one of the enduring lessons of modern warfare. In a world where machines moved faster than communication, where battlefields turned silent in seconds, it wasn't command that saved men's lives. It was the quiet courage to act when no one else would. In the great machinery of World War II, Corporal James Miller's name was never engraved on any memorial or mentioned in official dispatches. Yet his moment of defiance embodied a shift that defined an entire generation of American soldiers. They had entered the war as disciplined, uncertain men, trained to follow every command, cautious and deliberate. They ended it as veterans shaped by chaos, their instincts sharpened by the brutal logic of survival. Historians would later describe the Western Front in late 1944 as a crucible of adaptation. The Allies, battered by years of German tactical superiority, began to evolve, not through top-down reforms, but through the intuition of individuals who refused to freeze when seconds decided life or death. The American soldier, once seen by German officers as predictable and procedural, had become a force of improvisation. That transformation was not the product of orders. It was the product of moments like Miller's. If a photograph could capture it, it would not show glory. It would show exhaustion. The blackened faces of tank crews, their eyes hollow from sleepless nights, the burned horizon of a battlefield that looked more like the surface of another world. Victory was not triumph, it was endurance. For every heroic headline that came out of Europe, thousands of stories like Miller's faded quietly into the margins, too complicated, too human for the clean language of after-action reports. Yet those unrecorded decisions were what turned the tide. One man firing a second too soon, another refusing to retreat, a medic running through artillery fire to save a stranger. History rarely remembers names, but it remembers outcomes, and outcomes are built from those invisible moments of instinct and fear. In the decades that followed, armored warfare changed, but the lesson endured. Modern tank crews still train under the doctrine of initiative, trusting that the man behind the gun might one day have to make a choice no radio or order can prepare him for. The Army now calls it disciplined disobedience, the paradox Miller lived before it had a name. If there's a moral to his story, it isn't about defiance, it's about judgment, the ability to see through confusion, to trust one's senses when orders fall silent. War at its core is the collapse of certainty, and in that collapse, the difference between defeat and survival often comes down to a single decision, made by someone who simply refuses to wait. When the fog lifted over that ridge near Aachen, 3 German tanks lay in ruin, and an entire platoon was alive because one man chose to act. History moved on, indifferent as ever, but for a fleeting moment in the chaos of 1944, instinct had spoken louder than command.